So from our first reading from St. Paul's letter to the Colossians is a very, very rich passage that was proclaimed this morning. And we don't have time to break down this passage verse by verse, although we need to do that to understand what St. Paul is saying. But I want to focus on the latter part of the reading, verse 15, when St. Paul gives us a wonderful teaching on the importance of the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ. Now, looking at the liturgical calendar, this Sunday is the exaltation of the Holy Cross, and so we will be observing that on Sunday. The feast of the exaltation of the Holy Cross trumps an ordinary time on Sunday, and so we will be focusing on the Holy Cross. St. Paul's letter to the Colossians gives us a beautiful, beautiful teaching about the importance of the cross. St. Paul says this, that he removed it from our midst, that is, legal claims, a debt that we owed to the law of God. Every time we sin against God, guess what? It's like a debt that we owe to the law of God. We owe the law of God obedience. But when we sin, it's like racking up a debt. And Paul says that he took our debt, he took what we owed and nailed it to the cross, despoiling the principalities and the powers. He made a public spectacle of them, leading them away in triumph by it. Notice that he says that through the cross, the principalities and the powers are despoiled. Colossians, like the letter to the Ephesians, is very rich in spiritual teaching regarding the principalities and the powers of the air. And Paul has already said in our reading that he is above those principalities and powers. He's above all those powers. And what are those powers? Well, first of all, they're spiritual creatures. They were created by the Lord. He created all things by his own power, by the word of his power. He created them for himself. And as you know, Satan was an angelic being that God created, and then he rebelled. And the Bible teaches us that a third of the angels rebelled with him, and there's where we get what often is referred to in the Gospels, like in our reading this morning, the unclean spirits, the evil one, and the demons. But St. Paul reiterates in his letter to the Colossians that our Lord is their Lord. They are not on equal terms with him. They are his created beings, and yet they rebelled against his authority and his plan of salvation. But he is still Lord, and there'll be a day when he will take Satan and the evil angelic beings and cast them into the lake of fire. They are not in control of the lake of fire. Jesus is in control of the lake of fire. He's the Lord of heaven and earth. And so when we look at the cross, St. Paul is telling us something was happening there in the spiritual realm that when you look at it for face value, you don't see what's really happening here. There's more that's happening in the spiritual world than what meets the physical eye. When we look at the crucifixion of our Lord, we would look at that, if we were able to observe it, we would look at it like this is another Jewish person that the Romans are crucifying. He's just either a criminal or he's an innocent man that's been framed, and he's going to be crucified like so many others. You know, the Greeks and the Romans practiced crucifixion. That method of execution was well known. Now, you may recall that a Roman citizen could not be crucified. That's why St. Paul was beheaded and not crucified, because he was a Roman citizen. So if you look at our Lord's crucifixion at face value, well, this is just another non-Roman person that's being put to death over something that he's done or he's been accused of. St. Paul says there's a lot more going on here than what meets the eye. He says that through the cross, the principalities and the powers, the demonic forces, Satan himself, have been despoiled. Well, what does that word despoiled mean? Well, the word that's used there actually can also mean stripped. In other words, the principalities and powers, those spiritual beings, evil beings, they've been stripped of their authority and power. So if we looked at face value, what was happening at our Lord's crucifixion, we see him stripped of his garments. You remember that part of the Passion? We see him stripped of his garments, but what was really happening, according to St. Paul, was he was stripping the principalities and powers of their authority and power over him. They had no authority and power over him. He was stripping them of any authority and power that they might have, not only over him, but as we know, over this world. St. Paul says that he, through the cross, made a public spectacle of them. In looking at the crucifixion, we see it's a shameful death. It's not only a cruel death, but a shameful death. And scholars tell us that our Lord, more than likely, was crucified without any clothes. His shame was to be seen by all the bystanders around. It was a shameful death, first of all, because it was a crucifixion. Because the Jews believed that those who hung on a tree were cursed by God, and they would have been appalled at the crucifixion of its cruelty, but also its shame. Our Lord was stripped of his garments and was crucified before all to see. But through his crucifixion, he was actually making a public spectacle of the devil and his angels. St. Paul says that he led them away in triumph by it. And it is the cross. Do you know what a triumph is? If we lived back in the ancient Roman Empire, we would know what a triumph is. A triumph is when a Roman general would return to Rome, and there would be, lack of a better term, a parade. And that Roman general would lead that parade in his chariot. He's the conquering general. And behind him would be all the spoils of war and all the people that he had captured, all the prisoners of war and women and children. That's a triumph. It's a boastful parade over the enemy. It's a victory march over the enemy. If you go to Rome, you can go see what? The Arch of Titus. And on the Arch of Titus, we see the triumph of Rome over Jerusalem. We see the spoils of war. One of the things that you can still see is the menorah from the temple, where the Roman general took the menorah and the other sacred vessels. After destroying Jerusalem and the temple, he took those as spoils of war. And then also you see the train of slaves, prisoners of war. That's what a triumph is. It's making a public spectacle of your enemy, of your defeated enemy. And St. Paul says, when you think about the cross, or maybe some of them at that point were eyewitnesses of the crucifixion of our Lord, don't go by what you see with the naked eye. There's something spiritual happening here. Our Lord is triumphing over the forces of evil. He is shaming them. He's making them a public spectacle. This is his triumph. You see, the triumphal entry, when Jesus came into Jerusalem on Sunday, continued on that week. Even his death and his passion, his crucifixion, was part of that triumph. You see, the devil thought that it would be a good idea for Jesus to die. And he was foolish. He didn't realize, or he didn't want to realize. He was probably too proud. He probably thought he could defeat our Lord on the cross. But that's not what happened. The cross is the triumph of our Lord. And so this triumph, Paul says, occurred through the cross. So don't look at the cross as a sign of weakness. Look at it as a triumph. A triumph that our Lord promised way back in the garden many, many years before, when he told the evil one, I'm going to put enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring and hers. You will bruise his heel, but he will crush your head.